CrossCode's combat is unlike anything I've ever seen before. So what makes a good combat system in a video game? Well, there are plenty of factors that play into it, but I think it boils down to three main ideas: risk, options, and limits. Risk is all about giving the player the ability to take a chance for a reward. It's effectively gambling. Options are all about what the combat allows you to do. Limits are the extent of your abilities. How much can you do before the game makes you stop? CrossCode juggles these three ideas in a brilliant way. But CrossCode takes it a step further. Where most games would stop here, CrossCode adds 4 elements that change the combat dramatically. From icy pillboxes to Dragon Ball-esque energy beams to fiery combos that would make the most skilled firebenders proud. And the fact that how you dispatch your enemy is totally up to you is what makes this game's combat truly incredible. When you risk something big and it pays off, it feels great. Look at Monster Hunter, for example. You can parry with the charge blade, but if you miss, you leave yourself wide open, while if you hit, you can deal tremendous damage. Like I said, taking risks is akin to gambling. It's all about throwing it all on the table and seeing what you can get away with. When it pays off, you get your dopamine, and either you stop or you go for it again. So how does this work in CrossCode? Well, there are plenty of ways. Let's start with the most fundamental of all, parrying. You can block in CrossCode by pressing whatever button is associated with block. Look, I tried to say, oh, you can block with the X button or the B button, but I realized this game it's on everything. Even PC. So honestly, I don't know what you use to block. Whatever, the point is, you can block in this game, and when you time it just right, you parry, and sometimes even send your enemy into a vulnerable state called break. In this state, they take more damage and are often stunned. The other benefit from parrying is it prevents you from taking damage and knockback and allows you to act instantly after blocking. Now if that was all you could risk in CrossCode, then it would be cool, but it wouldn't be anything special. I mean, I struggle to think of a game with good combat that doesn't have some kind of parry mechanic. CrossCode doesn't just have risks involved with parrying. There's also a mechanic in this game that allows you to change into one of the 4 elements, but we'll talk about that later. When someone tells you you can't do something, you instantly want to do it. The reason for this is something I'm not going to talk about since I'm not a psychology channel. However, it's because of this fact that when video games give you more options, they're instantly more enjoyable. The only caveat being, your options actually have to be fun. And don't worry, in CrossCode, they absolutely are. Here's a basic rundown of the combat in CrossCode. You see, you have 4 options at any given moment in CrossCode's combat. You can shoot, melee, dodge, and guard. Simple enough, right? Wrong. Each of these options has a bit more to them than you might think. When you shoot, you have the option to charge for one powerful shot, or to rapid fire less powerful individual shots with less accuracy. Dashing has a pretty straightforward secondary aspect. You get invincibility frames in a small part of your dodge. Melee attacks are actually pretty similar to range. You can mash the attack button to get a full 4-hit combo that ends in a spin. Or, if you wanted to, you could cancel this combo at any point with a dash. So, do you go for a bunch of smaller, quick hits, or do you go for a full combo? The game gives you options, and that's why it's so fun. How you dispatch your enemy is up to your personal playstyle. The last thing I want to talk about are limits. As with the other 2 mechanics before this one, every great combat system has its limits. Dark Souls has stamina, Hollow Knight has soul, Monster Hunter has... this? I don't have to explain why this is a limit, right? It's these limits that make combat balanced. Without these, you could just mash mindlessly. If there were no limits, you would have no reason to think about what you're doing before you do it. The biggest limit in CrossCode is the overload system. It prevents you from overusing elements and forces you to balance elements with your neutral form. Of course, CrossCode has the SP system as well. It dictates how often you can use your special moves. Similar to the Soul system in Hollow Knight, it prevents you from mindlessly using your specials nonstop. You recharge it by attacking, which is great. This game rewards you for being aggressive by giving you the ability to be even more aggressive. Now that you have a basic understanding of the fundamentals of the combat, let's talk about the enemies. So I made this chart. Quality of you on the Y relates to how much fun your character feels to control. A good example of this is something like Mega Man Zero, where a lot of the fun in the game comes from what you can do with your character. Quality of opposition on the X relates to the quality of your enemies. You could fight a bunch of enemies that act like ragdolls, or you could fight a great enemy like Virgil. When both of these aspects work together perfectly, you get a brilliant combat system. And if either one is unbalanced, you'll get a combat system that kind of falls apart. Imagine if you were so overpowered you could defeat any enemy in the game in one single hit. Or if you had infinite health so there was never a threat. That wouldn't be very fun. And equally, if every enemy was near unkillable and impossible to beat, that would get exhausting pretty fast. It's all about balancing these 2 aspects. So naturally, the best games will land somewhere around here. Here's CrossCode on that chart. See, CrossCode does both of these aspects brilliantly. Let's start with how it handles enemies. So as I mentioned earlier, there's this mechanic called break. When in this state, enemies take much more damage and oftentimes can't even move. But there's more to it than that. Each enemy has a different way to break them. For example, these hedgehogs in the first area of the game can be parried when they attack you. If you do this, they'll break, and they'll be left wide open for damage. You can break these weasels by shooting them while they're charging for their big attack. Elements are involved in breaking too. Some enemies require that you switch between elements if you want to break them quickly. My favorite example of this is the sandworm in the desert. You can take him out normally without using the fire element, but it'll take a while. However, if you do choose to use fire on it, you can break it and do extra damage. Pretty cool, right? Wrong, that's lame. Which is why the CrossCode devs didn't stop there. Once broken by fire, the sandworm begins its own fearsome fiery fever pitch of attacks. This attack is much more difficult to dodge, but they also take more damage. So you're given the option to take a risk for more damage, or you can just take it out normally, but it'll take you a bit more time. Of course, even the bosses force you to switch elements. Look at the first boss. It shoots out these bombs, which you can send back at it with a fire attack to break its shields. And of course, it wouldn't be an RPG without elemental weaknesses. Most enemies are weak to a certain type of element that you can switch to deal a bit more damage to them. Alright, I've danced around this topic enough. Let's finally talk about the best mechanic in CrossCode, the elements. By the end of CrossCode, you'll have access to 4 elements: fire, ice, shock, and wave. Elements are what propel this game's combat from great to incredible. They provide endless options and customization for combat. They interact with enemies in brilliant ways, and they're perfectly tuned to prevent them from getting unbalanced. You unlock each of these 4 elements in temples as you progress through the game, and each one grants you new abilities and options. I briefly mentioned this earlier, but there are some special attacks that you can use with the SP bar. These special attacks are based on one of the 4 options I mentioned at the beginning: dodge, melee, range, and block. And each element has their own unique special attacks. Ice, for example, has a guard ability that goes around your entire character as opposed to just in front. It also has an ice pillbox that I mentioned earlier. And fire can do stuff like this. I mean, come on. If you don't like that, you just don't like video games. But that's not all. Changing elements changes your stats as well. Fire, for example, is all about damage, so when you switch to it, your attack skyrockets. This adds even more depth to this combat, as it means when you switch elements, you're not only gaining new attacks, but an entirely new playstyle. Maybe your enemy is really fast and you want to focus on defense, so you switch to ice. But as soon as you manage to break them, you switch to fire to deal as much damage as possible. Now, of course, there are limits to these systems. See this gauge in the top left? The more you use the elements, the more this gauge increases. And if you let it get all the way to the top, you'll lose your connection to all the past habits. Wait, that's not right. You enter a state called overload, where you can't use any elements until the gauge goes back down to 0. This gauge decreases over time, but you can make it decrease even faster if you use neutral attacks. That way you're not just waiting around. The combat never stops, and that's just great. However, this is only one half of the coin, right? What about the enemies? Well, as I mentioned earlier, the enemies take advantage of this elemental system as well. With each element you unlock, not only do your abilities get more varied and complex, but the enemies do as well. You see, when you have access to all of these options, you can build enemies around them, making for a combat system that's not just fun, but challenging and engaging. Let's look at a few examples. Of course, there's the sandworm from earlier, who can be broken by fire to lower its defense but increase its offense. The Tri-Jelly is another great example of enemies forcing you to switch elements to fight them. This enemy shoots bubbles at you, and if you attack those bubbles with the heat element, you can break them. Again, it's technically possible to beat this enemy without switching, but it would just take a while. Of course, not all enemies force you into a specific element. These beetles in Sapphire Ridge are just a pure test of skill. The best way to break them is by parrying. Overall, the elements just add so much to this game and truly elevate its combat to a near unreachable level. This game perfectly juggles risk, option, and limits, while also adding its own unique style. The enemies are just as brilliant as the character you use to defeat them, and the way you choose to defeat them is totally up to you. That's what makes CrossCode's combat great. Anyway, give this game a try. It's actually not all combat. The stories, the characters, the music, they're all fantastic as well. And it would be a real shame to see a game like this fly under the radar.